by the reaches of civilization.
May God add understanding to these words, because it is these very words of Paul's that caused the separation between Catholic and Protestant. Scholars say that more people died in that centuries of warfare over those few words than died in World War I and World War II together. And if that wasn't bad enough, what if I told you that it was all over a misunderstanding? I'm sure all of you in your lives have known the tragedy that can come from misunderstanding, the brokenness, the betrayals, the pain of misunderstanding. In this case, theologically, it was catastrophic. The horrors are unspeakable. What a sad legacy. And my aim today is not to give you a history lesson, but to go back to the essence of what it was meant to say to us.
By the reaches of civilization.
And to do that, we have to break through the first century language, the context that Paul came out of, so that we can speak 21st century ease, so that we can speak about our lives now. What is this saying to us? Imagine just a few weeks ago, we studied the final prayer of Jesus, may they all be one, the Holy of Holies. And then nothing but breakdown.
By the reaches of civilization.
Not only Catholic and Protestant, but then split after split among Protestants. I feel sorry for those looking for God today. There are so many different versions, and yet it was meant to be so simple, so beautiful, so unifying. What a mess we make of things, especially divine things. I'll take you back to the Old Testament, because this is the essence of it. He has heard my voice and my supplications. Now don't think of David or the psalmist. Think of yourself. The promise of these divine teachings is that the Holy One who created that sunrise or sunset, who is greater than anything we can imagine, the uncreated one who created us, hears your supplication. Take that as a reality. Open yourself to that. I will call upon Him as long as I live. He is still calling upon the Lord. Even in pain and suffering, He is still strong in faith. And again, as I've said before, the difference between that kind of glorious transition and the despair that so much of humanity feels is the great tragedy that these teachings that the Christ seeks to overcome, may they be overcome for you. I suffered distress and anguish. Is this not a word for everybody here? Have we not all suffered distress and anguish? Perhaps there are some right now in distress and anguish. What do we read then? Then I called on the name of the Lord. You see, we are not meant to do this by ourselves. We are not designed for that. We cannot. Life is too overwhelming. There are too many obstacles against us. No matter how strong and independent we'd like to be, we're just fragile creatures, even in our prime. So call upon the name of the Lord. Dare to invoke God into your little situation, because we know that it matters to the Holy One. Your trouble matters to the Holy One. Your loneliness, your fears, your doubts, all of it. This is not generic. It is specific and intimate for all of us. Our God is merciful. When I was brought low, imagine what that means. When I was brought low, He saved you. And some of you know what that means. I'll tell you, I know what that means. And I hope most of you are here because you know what that means. Nothing but that power of our Maker can lift us back up from some of the trials and tribulations we go through. So count on it. In these beautiful words, return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. We are meant, the objective is to be at peace. To be at peace even in trials and tribulations, because we know the living God. Not a new message, we hear it a lot, but are we applying it? That is the issue, and that's why this passage from Romans is very important, because in it, buried behind words that are
by the reaches of civilization,
perhaps confusing, is the method, is the instruction, the how-to, the 1, 2, 3 for all of us.
by the reaches of civilization.
We hear Paul say, therefore, since we are justified by faith, almost a throwaway line. He spent 3 chapters setting it up, Abraham and so forth, trying to express in his way what it means to connect with God. How do we connect with God? That's the issue. And it's this justified by faith that created the confusion. Martin Luther played a role in this, as you know. Being a monk for 20 years, trying as best he could to perfect himself and not finding that inner peace, that connection with God. And so finally he had this illumination in reading this text. All it was faith. And the Church Universal in the West, the Catholic Church, said, no, that's not all. It's faith, hope, and love. It's a lifetime of becoming. It's works of goodness as a result of faith. Faith active in love. But old Martin, the German bulldog, said it's only faith. Sole fide.
By the reaches of civilization.
And that is the origin of a theology that exists to this day, where all you have to do, according to some clergy, is say a prayer so you believe it. Boom, you're saved. Just like Pop-Tarts, just like a microwave deal. Is that not absurd? It doesn't work that way. This is a process of personal change and transformation.
By the reaches of civilization.
And it has been completely muddled and confused by Paul, who didn't want to confuse anybody. He says, we have obtained access to this grace. Now that word access, which is the title of the sermon, is an important word. Look it up in the dictionary. What is access? Entering, acceptance, admission, initiation, welcome. You and I, we are welcome. We are initiated into a relationship with the living Spirit. We have access to encounter with Spirit. So it's not about faith as an intellectual belief. And you get your Christian card and everything goes on its merry way. It's not a faith where if you live any old way and go to church on Sunday, do your confession and come back on Monday and just live any old way. That's absurd. That's tragic. That's what makes Christianity of no interest to so many of our brothers and sisters.
By the reaches of civilization.
But if we go deep, we discover the power. How do you become initiated into your relationship to the Holy that protects and inspires you and gives you the strength to go on? The opposite, the antonym of access is denial expulsion, exclusion, refusal. So you can see how important that is, because that is not a good direction to go in. If we do not seek to have access to something greater than ourselves that gave us birth and life, then we cut ourselves off. Not through God's wrath, for God is unconditional goodness, always seeking us, but through our own foolishness, our own misunderstanding. And so, let me try to explain to you why this got so confusing. Talking about righteousness and justification, what are these words? Would you believe these are two words that come from one Greek word that got split up in English? You know, translations are a complicated matter. You got to be very careful. It could start a war if it's done wrong. Justification and righteousness. Let me help you put that in some real English. To be justified, to become righteous, is to become as we ought to be. To have a quality of living, that's what righteousness is, a quality of living that is based on obeying the way of Christ. Does that make sense to people? You see how righteousness can just sit there and not mean anything to you, but quality of life based on applying the teachings of Jesus, on obeying these holy wisdom teachings, that's something we can do today. And justification, strange theological term, tied to righteousness,
by the reaches of civilization,
means conformity to the will of God. Recall, one line, life is not worth living and has no meaning if we are not following the will of God. What wisdom from a faithful servant who lived a lifetime seeking to do so. So put aside justified by faith,
by the reaches of civilization.
Put aside righteousness because they are words that are disconnected with our immediate reality. Understand them as how to have a way of life
by the reaches of civilization
that is pleasing to God, that is shown to us here. How to become compassionate, how to stop being impatient, how to live in anger all the time. We have so many clues, you know, it isn't some kind of esoteric mystery. In Ephesians, it says, put on the new self, which is in the likeness of God, and has been created in righteousness and holiness of the truth. In James, it says, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Again and again, we hear these words calling on us to become all that we can be. And as I've quoted before, a philosopher, to keep it simple, how can you change if you remain the same? If you go to church for 40 years and not a single attribute, habit of your personality has changed, you have missed the boat. The train has left the station. We are here for that transformation. And because so many churches don't do that, they are empty.
By the reaches of civilization.
But I assure you that visitors who come here and see the warmth, the Christian life alive and well in you are going to come back. Because there is a hunger in the world for what we are truly meant to be, how we are truly meant to live. And so then he gives us, past these difficult terms, a modern psychology. Seems simple at first, but
by the reaches of civilization.
Let's see if it sinks in for you. Suffering produces endurance. And I'll read from the Amplified. The Amplified tells us we rejoice in our suffering, knowing that pressure and affliction and hardship produce patience and unswerving endurance, tried integrity, maturity of character. What does that mean? I've told you this before, it's one of the great genius secrets of this divine revelation. Our suffering, your suffering, can be turned into fuel for spiritual awakening, rather than bitterness, misery, anger, brokenness, as happens for so many. That old saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I know people don't like to hear that because they don't want to go through that. But the fact is, this life is going to cause us to have to endure whatever it is you have to go through. And this secret, this gnosis, this divine wisdom is take that suffering and persevere
by the reaches of civilization.
Through it, endure it, walk through it, and stay faithful to the knowledge that God will help you, and that will build the character, maturity of spirit that empathizes with others, that is broken out of its own self-absorption. Don't you know that? Most people don't grow up till they've suffered. Most people never get out of their number one interest, themselves, till self-absorption, until pain makes them realize that their brother and sister also suffers and they know what it's like. So this suffering that life brings us becomes fuel for development instead of misery, as it is for most of humanity. And out of that maturity of character, of this right use of suffering, of hanging in there, of never giving up, comes hope. Hope out of a maturity of character that has understood that above and beyond everything, there is the living God, seeking to help us through, seeking to lift us out of our circumstances, that we may be witnesses to the eternal in time, to our true home, our true nature as spiritual beings. These are the instructions. How did they get missed? You know, Martin Luther did not want to create the Lutheran Church, as I told you before. The Lutherans were more Lutheran than Luther. He didn't want to break up the church. And of course the church was already broken up, because in the West it was Catholic, in the East it was Orthodox. And to the Orthodox who came from the land of Jesus, taught by the apostles, all this business of justified by faith was irrelevant, because they were focused on theosis, God realization, the consciousness, the access to Spirit that fills our being and makes us new creatures in Christ. Don't you know this is practical? It's not a fantasy or philosophy. It's not a belief system you have to cram into your head and try to hold on to in spite of your reason. It's the power of God made accessible to each of us in every choice we make in every moment of life. If only we remember that the battle is in the heat of the moment, in every moment. And so here we have a mighty teaching whose misunderstanding virtually destroyed the church, but the church will not be destroyed in spite of human beings. We can come back to the message, which is a message of becoming people of true compassion and love. Let's start right here, right now. Let's live the truth of the gospel.